It's pretty wild to think that on the same planet where we're developing self-driving cars and planning trips to Mars, there are places where the daily struggle isn't about progress, it's just about finding the next meal, where simply surviving another day is a huge victory.
And I want to be clear, this isn't something from a history book. This is happening right now. In places like Somalia and South Sudan, this is the reality of pure desperation. It's a human story that goes so far beyond any economic report or spreadsheet.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How can this possibly be? Today, we're going to try to untangle some of the incredibly complex knots that keep nations trapped in poverty. From wars funded by a country's own treasures to the devastating effects of a changing climate. Let's dig in. Okay, so first up is something that is just a deeply cruel irony. Some of the poorest nations in the world are, get this, sitting on top of an incredible amount of natural wealth. It really should be a blessing, but so often it ends up being a curse. Why is that?
Well, take Sierra Leone, for example. When you hear that name, you probably think of brilliant, sparkling diamonds, the ultimate symbol of luxury. But for the people who actually live there, that image it's a total mirage. A staggering 70% of the population lives in poverty. How on earth does that even happen?
Well, it's because those very diamonds, the ones that should have built schools and hospitals and roads, were instead sold off to buy weapons. They literally fueled a brutal, decade-long civil war. And by the time the fighting finally stopped, the economy was completely shattered, leaving this legacy of poverty that the country is still grappling with today.
And this is the human cost, boiled down to one single number. The average person in Sierra Leone makes less than $2 a day. Just stop and think about that for a second. Imagine trying to feed your family, pay for shelter, maybe dream of an education for your kids on less than $2 a day. It's not a challenge, it's a constant, relentless battle.
And this isn't just a one-off story. Look at the Central African Republic. It's a country that's rich in diamonds, gold, even uranium. But after decades of conflict, the average person there earns less than a single dollar a day. So where does all that wealth go? It gets siphoned off, making foreign companies and a few local elites rich, while the vast majority of people, including 70% of the nation's kids who don't even go to school, are left with nothing.
But it's not always about a country's resources. For some nations, the root of their poverty is simpler, and maybe even more brutal. It's just the relentless, destructive power of war. Decades of instability can literally dismantle a country piece by piece, shredding its economy and the very fabric of its society. And there is no clearer or more heartbreaking example of this than Yemen. Since 2015, a truly devastating civil war has pushed the entire country to the absolute brink, earning it this tragic, awful title.
The scale of this crisis is it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Imagine a country where 80% of the people, that's 4 out of every 5, men, women, and children, rely on outside help just to survive. The basic systems that we all take for granted, for food, for clean water, for medicine, they've simply collapsed.
And of course, in any conflict, it's the most vulnerable who pay the steepest price. Almost half of all children in Yemen are malnourished. This war isn't just stealing their childhoods, it's erasing their futures before they've even had a chance to begin.
And then you have the tragic story of South Sudan, the world's newest country. It was born in 2011 with so much hope, but it took just 2 years for a brutal civil war to completely shatter that hope. Today, the nation is trapped in this horrible cycle of conflict and famine, a dream of freedom that's turned into a nightmare of survival.
So, conflict and corruption, they're obviously devastating forces, but they aren't the only ones. For some nations, the greatest enemy is the land itself, which is being transformed by a changing climate. These countries are on the front lines of a global crisis they did very little to create, where shifting weather is literally a matter of life and death.
Let's look at the Sahel region. We're talking about countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Here, the economy is overwhelmingly tied to the earth. A full 80% of it comes from farming and raising livestock. That means people's entire existence is balanced on a knife's edge, completely at the mercy of predictable weather.
And here is the massive problem. That predictable weather is gone. The Sahara Desert is relentlessly creeping south. Year after year, fertile farmland that families have worked for generations just turns into barren wasteland. The very ground beneath their feet, the foundation of their survival, is literally turning to dust.
And what's really devastating is that these crises rarely happen in a vacuum. They feed on each other. Take Burundi, for example. Over 90% of the people are farmers, and they're trapped in this vicious cycle. On one side, you have extreme weather, crippling droughts followed by catastrophic floods. On the other side, a long, painful history of political conflict and corruption. The result, it's a perfect storm that leaves 1 in every 3 children in the country malnourished.
So, you see, whether the primary cause is conflict or corruption or a rapidly changing climate, the result on the ground looks hauntingly similar. Across all of these different nations, we find the shared human cost, the exhausting, all-consuming daily struggle just to exist. And this, for me, might be the most heartbreaking cost of all. In many of these countries, up to 70% of children will never once step inside a classroom. Think about that. It's a colossal, immeasurable loss of human potential, a future that's stolen before it even gets a chance to start.
You know, it's so important to understand what poverty on this scale really means. We're not talking about lacking luxuries like a new car or the latest phone. We're talking about lacking the absolute fundamentals of modern life. Clean water doesn't just come from a tap. It might be a walk that takes hours. Electricity isn't a given. And seeing a doctor, that's a rare privilege, not a basic right.
And this is where that lack of infrastructure becomes truly deadly. Because healthcare systems are so broken, common illnesses that are easily treatable for us, things like malaria or even diarrhea, become top killers. Without access to basic medicine, a simple infection can quickly become a death sentence.
Okay, so understanding these deep, tangled-up problems is definitely the first step. But it always leads to a much bigger and much more difficult question. When poverty is this entrenched, is there any way out?
There are no simple fixes here. As we've seen, these are deeply interconnected cycles, where war fuels poverty, climate change fuels conflict, and corruption just fuels everything. And it leaves all of us with a really difficult question to ponder. When you see these tangled messes, what is the world's responsibility to help break them? Can these cycles ever